All right, here we go. Chapter 4. Monday, September 10th, 2001. Monday came, the last day before Lucas would be allowed back on the field. He'd been crossing out the days on his calendar, counting down. Mom picked him up early from school for a doctor's appointment. She wanted him checked out before he was cleared to play. "I'm fine," Lucas said. "Can't you tell?" Lucas lifted his arm and flexed his bicep. Mom laughed. "You look incredible." Mom had decided to take him to a new doctor. "I hear he's the best," she said. "We were lucky he could fit you in." His name was Dr. Barrett. With his blonde crew cut and huge shoulders, he looked more like a linebacker than a doctor. Dr. Barrett brought Lucas into an exam room and checked him over. Looking in his eyes, listening to his heart and lungs, he asked him to walk across the room with one foot in front of the other. Lucas was sure he passed all the tests. After the exam, Dr. Barrett waved Mom and Lucas back into his office. The wall was covered with framed diplomas and pictures of football players. Lucas looked at a photo of a rough-looking man in a Denver Broncos uniform. "That's Dan Brock," Dr. Barrett said. "Have you heard of him?" The name was familiar, but Lucas didn't know why. He was an All-American at the University of Wisconsin, then a third-round pick for the NFL. Dr. Barrett pointed to the next photo in the row, the big smiling man with a busted-up nose and chubby baby cheeks. "That's Tyrus Vallone," he said. "He was a star tackle at Florida State." And then he played 10 years for Green Bay. There were 3 other pictures on the wall. It was only the last one that Lucas recognized. "Is that Stan Walsh? Isn't he?" He was dead. He had died just a few months ago. Uncle Benny had been upset about it. He'd played against Stan Walsh when he was a college player. Dr. Barrett nodded, seeing that Lucas knew about Stan Walsh. He had just turned 40. The doctor said. He had the same kind of brain disease you see in men in their 80s. Dr. Barrett pointed up at the wall, at all of the players. "All of those men are dead," he said. "They donated their brains to our lab so we can study them. They all died because of concussions." A chill ran up and down Lucas's spine. He looked at Mom. Her eyes were wide with shock. "We used to think concussions were like sprained ankles," Dr. Barrett said. "You get dinged, you let it heal, and you're good to go. But now we know that too many concussions can actually change the brain." "How many concussions is too many?" Mom asked. Lucas held his breath. "I would say that in an 11-year-old boy, 3 concussions in 2 years is too many." The room was suddenly quiet. Lucas could feel the eyes of those football players looking down on him. "I can stay out another week," Lucas said. It would be torture, but he'd be back in time for the first game. "I'm sorry, Lucas," Dr. Barrett said, "but what I'm suggesting is that you never play football again." All night, Lucas argued and begged. He had a million reasons why the doctor was wrong. And he told Mom and Dad practically every single one. When that didn't work, he offered to sit out for 2 more weeks, then 3. "Just please don't make me quit." Finally, Dad put his hands on Lucas's shoulders. "Lucas," Dad said in a soft voice, "football is a game. I know you love it, but it is just a game. A game." Of course, Lucas knew that, but the game was the most important thing in his life. What would he do without his team? That night, he lay awake in bed for hours thinking. It was past midnight when he realized what he needed to do. He had to see Uncle Benny. Before Mom and Dad talked to Coach, before it was too late. Dad left early the next morning. He was teaching a class at The Rock, the firefighter training school, across a bridge from Manhattan on Randall's Island. Mom dropped Lucas off at the bus stop on her way to work. The minute her car disappeared, Lucas sprinted back home. He grabbed his bike and pedaled as fast as he could to the train station. He caught the 7:17 with 1 minute to spare. Lucas knew how wrong this was, to skip school, to sneak into the city without Mom and Dad knowing. But right then, none of that mattered. He had to see Uncle Benny. Somehow, Uncle Benny would make this right. Chapter 5. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, 8:15 a.m., New York City, New York. Lucas had made this trip so many times with Dad, he knew it by heart. The train to Penn Station, the subway to Canal Street. When he got out of the subway, he looked up and found his landmark, the two silver buildings jutting into the sky. The twin towers of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was 9 blocks south of the fire station, so he just followed his view of the towers until he hit the right street. As Lucas walked, he thought of the last time he and Dad visited the Trade Center. They'd gotten there early, before the observation deck was open, but the guard noticed Dad's FDNY hat and let them go up. They had the place to themselves. The view from the 110th floor was like looking down on Manhattan from a cloud. The whole island stretched out in front of them. The buildings below looked like toys. The rivers like trickling streams. The cars and trucks looked smaller than the models Lucas and Dad built in the basement. They stood there, just Dad and Lucas, alone on top of the world. That was right before the Waterhouse fire, only 2 years before now. It seemed like a very long time ago. When Lucas got to the firehouse, the garage door was open. And there, right next to the sea grave, was Uncle Benny. He glanced up and gave an offhand smile, obviously thinking that Lucas was just a neighborhood kid hoping to get a peek at the truck. But then Uncle Benny looked at Lucas again. "Hey, you," he said with a surprised grin, striding over. He pulled Lucas into the garage. Lucas breathed in the familiar smell of diesel fuel and sweat. He'd always loved the sight of all the guys' black bunker coats hanging on the walls, the pants already tucked into the big black boots. The firehouse was crowded. The guys from the last shift were saying their goodbyes, and the morning men were just getting settled. Guys came from all over the firehouse to say hi to Lucas, wrapping him in bear hugs, rubbing his head, and telling him he was growing like a weed. "I've missed my assistant," said Georgie, who drove the truck and also did most of the cooking. On Lucas's visits with Dad, his favorite job was to help Georgie cook his famous tomato sauce. Chief Douglas came over, his smile flashing from under his bushy gray mustache, followed by Mark, one of the youngest guys. He and his family lived not far from Lucas. His 8-year-old twin boys were football fanatics, and Mark coached their team. Last season, they came to one of Lucas's games. Afterwards, the twins had asked Lucas for his autograph. Suddenly, Uncle Benny looked around. "Where's your pops?" he said. "He's already done at the Rock?" Lucas shook his head. "Your mom brought you?" Uncle Benny said. Lucas shook his head again. Uncle Benny eyed Lucas, and his smile faded. "You okay?" he said softly. Lucas didn't answer. Uncle Benny looked at Georgie, who gave him a nod. "Cover me, will you guys?" Uncle Benny asked. "I'll be back in a few." Uncle Benny led Lucas outside, and they started walking. "This is some kind of day, isn't it?" he said, squinting up at the bright blue sky. Neither of them said anything more until finally Lucas came out with it. "Mom and Dad are making me quit football," he said, "because of my concussions." Lucas watched Uncle Benny's face, waiting for his eyebrows to mash together in anger, for his cheeks to burn furious red. But Uncle Benny just nodded. Then he looked at Lucas. "I've been worried about you, kiddo," he said. "You've got yourself a darned good brain. I don't want you ending up like poor Stan Walsh." And then it suddenly hit Lucas. It was Uncle Benny who got Mom to bring him to see Dr. Barrett. He must have known he'd been Stan Walsh's doctor. Lucas had come all this way because he thought Uncle Benny would help him, and Uncle Benny was the reason he had to quit. Uncle Benny stopped and put his hands on Lucas's shoulders. It seemed like he was trying to keep Lucas pinned to the ground, like otherwise he'd fly away. He stared at Lucas with those bright light eyes of his. "You'll find something else," he said. "What else do I have?" Lucas wanted to ask. But before he could, something over Lucas's shoulder caught Uncle Benny's attention. Lucas turned, and then he saw it too, a glint of silver against the bright blue sky. Out of nowhere, a huge jet airplane zoomed into view. It was flying very low. Chapter 6. "What the?" Uncle Benny said. He and Lucas stood and watched as the plane tore through the sky, its engines screaming. Everyone else on the sidewalk stopped and looked up. Lucas had never seen an airplane flying so low, except taking off or landing. He could see the plane so clearly, the engines tucked under the wings, the sun glinting off the windows. He could even read the letters on the tail. A. American Airlines. The engines roared. That plane had to be in trouble. It was going to crash. Questions raced through Lucas's mind. Had the plane's instruments broken? Was the pilot confused? Was he sick? Once Lucas heard about a pilot who had a heart attack in the middle of a flight. But that didn't make sense. There would be a co-pilot there to take over. Or maybe airplanes flew like this all the time in New York City, and Lucas just hadn't noticed before. Or no, it had to be a movie. That's it. Some action movie was being filmed over New York City. But where were the cameras? How were they filming the plane? Something was wrong, and everyone knew it. People up and down the sidewalk were stopped in their tracks, hypnotized by the sight of a jet ripping across the sky. The plane turned slightly, one wing dipping down. The engine's roar turned to a screech. It was moving faster now, and going lower and lower. It barely missed the tops of some buildings as it careened through the air. But just ahead, two buildings stood taller than the rest, the Twin Towers. The plane was heading right for one of the towers. Turn, Lucas wanted to scream. Pull up. But it didn't turn, and suddenly the plane plunged like a knife into the side of one of the buildings. For a split second, Lucas waited for the plane to reappear on the other side, to keep flying as though nothing had happened. But then, kaboom! A gigantic fireball, orange and black, exploded out of the side of the building. Lucas jumped back in horror. All around him, people screamed. Black, fiery smoke gushed out of a huge gash in the building's side, billowing into the sky. Lucas turned away. He couldn't look anymore. He looked at Uncle Benny instead. Uncle Benny was already shouting into his phone. Call dispatch. A plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. This is 1060. Yes, a 1060. 1060 was the worst kind of alarm. And that's when it hit Lucas. There had to be hundreds of people trapped in that tower. And no matter how dangerous it was, firefighters like Dad and Uncle Benny were going to try to save them.